What if we move to a sustainable society?
What if gas were $10 a gallon?
What if everyone voted?
What if everyone had health care?
What if?
What if?
What if? What if?
What if?
What if?
What if?
What if?
And I'd like to welcome you to the first in our series, this What If series, a series of plausible events that we'd like to use as an excuse to sort of engage the community in a discussion from the university perspective. And tonight, as you know, is the first that's going to be about what if gas were $10 a gallon in the next 2 to 5 years. I'd like to first off thank Barbara Eckstein, who's a professor in the Department of English, and it was her idea to come up with this what if scenario to begin with. And then we sort of brainstormed about some ways to do this, and we thought the best way would be to come up with what are some ideas that again are plausible, a little bit out there, but also raise a lot of other questions related to that our panelists are going to be touching on tonight. I'd like to next thank our co-sponsors for the event, and these are a number of community participants, including the Iowa City Public Library, the Johnson County Livable Community Group, the Iowa City Area Chamber of Commerce, the League of Women Voters of Johnson County, the Press Citizen, and PATV, who is going to be filming tonight. We do want everyone to be comfortable when they are involved in a discussion. If for some reason you do not want to be filmed during the discussion but would like to say something, we have that you can put your name on the sheet back there, and your part will be taken out of what will be then put on PATV later. So please don't feel uncomfortable from that perspective, and we really do want to try to create a dialogue. Very fortunate to have a really excellent panel with us tonight of people from the university, sort of broadly defined. On my left here is Paul Hanley, and Paul's a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and with the Public Policy Center. To his left is John Fuller, who is professor in urban regional planning and also at the Public Policy Center. You can see a little bit of a trend here. To John's left is Sue Chrysler, and Sue's appointment is at the National Advanced Driving Simulator, the College of Public Health, and the Public Policy Center. To her left is Dave Ricketts, and as much as we like to claim Dave, he doesn't actually have an appointment with the Public Policy Center officially, but he is the Director of Parking and Transportation for the university. And as I like to tell him, has one of the 2 worst jobs at the university. The only thing worse than I think is trying to determine where people park is what kind of space. So I think he has one of the 2 worst, but he does a great job with it. And our moderator tonight will be turned over as Wilf Nixon, and Wilf is also a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Okay. Thank you, Wilf.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pete. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this evening. The way this is going to work is we've broken this down into 3 areas. We'll get into what those are in a minute. And to kick each area of discussion off, we are, between us, going to make a few very brief comments. Now, that's challenging for faculty. You may not know, we are programmed to speak in 50-minute increments. That's one reason why I'm standing up. I don't have a seat, because if I or any of my colleagues go too long, it's my job to give them the hook. So, let's see if we can get going here. And this is where it gets challenging. Which one is me? All right, so here we go. What if gas cost $10 a gallon? Put that in context a little bit. If you go back to when gas really first became a commodity, and you look at the annual average prices, you can see we're not unusually high at the moment. We had a bit of a price shock in the early 70s, but if you take inflation out of things, we're just sort of heading up into the high regime right now, historical highs. But we are not unduly out of range. What that means is $10 a gallon would be truly unprecedented. The question is, how do we get there? Why might this happen? Well, where did the costs come from? If you look at a typical gallon of gas, when it's at a little over $3 a gallon, and it's very hard to figure out what the price is because it seems to change hour by hour in some of the places, but as you can see, a large part of the cost is the cost of the oil itself. Oil is a fungible commodity. It's on the world markets. It goes up and down in price on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis. I heard at lunchtime today it was at $102.71 for crude, Texas crude. Who knows what it was this evening? There are refining costs, distribution, and of course taxes. We're somewhat unusual here in the US in terms of developed countries in that the cost of our gasoline is relatively low. If you look in Europe, and if any of you have traveled in Europe, you'll know that the cost of gasoline is a lot higher over in Europe than it is here. In the Netherlands, which has the highest gas tax regime in Europe, it's nearly $9 a gallon. Crude oil, it's obviously a function of supply. Refining can be made more or less expensive, depending what limitations you place on the requirements. In certain parts of the country, gasoline appears to cost quite a lot more than it does elsewhere, and that's often because of refining requirements. Chicago is somewhat notable in that regard. Gas in Chicago has to meet certain refining requirements that we, here in Iowa, we don't require our gas to meet, so it's more expensive in Chicago. Obviously, if the fuel costs go up, your distribution costs will go up. But unless strange things happen, in all likelihood, the way we get to $10 a gallon is by significantly increasing the gas tax. Now, that's an open question as to whether or not that would happen. I think here in Iowa, we're arguing about a 10-cent a gallon increase. We'll see. What we're going to do is begin by looking at individual travel, and then consumer choice, and then new technology. As I said, we'll have some comments at the beginning. The bulk of the comments are going to be related to individual travel, a few on consumer choice, and then a few more on new technology, along with a couple of interesting videos that might give you a new perspective on things. But after each of these brief presentations that we give as a group, we will pause to try and get some feedback from you all. So be thinking about issues you want to raise, questions you want to ask, anything at all that you would like to discuss. And with that, I think, I got done in under 10 minutes. There we go. I think it's John, isn't it?
Yeah.
John. All right.
Okay, I'll go
I'm
for it.
standing here threatening you. Okay.
Well, I'll be pretty fast because actually you and I have picked up on some of the same points. I used Germany as a much better example, I think, than the Netherlands of what gasoline does cost today. We're a little bit lower in cost of gasoline here in Iowa than throughout the United States. Part of it is because of those user fees that Whiff was mentioning. But $10 a gallon is still hard to imagine in some respects. I think that's why you're here tonight, to extend your imagination a little bit. But it's not hard to imagine in a variety of other parts of the world. Norway actually exceeds $10 per gallon right now in terms of its cost. Turkey is pretty close, and as you look around the world, you'll find that there are other instances of quite high priced gasoline in comparison with the U.S. Situation. And I also had some information that I thought I might share about the way in which the price of gasoline has varied over time. and ways in which that variation has ended up really not finding us in 2014 at a much higher price than one would find in 1920, interestingly enough, in real terms. So you might ask, does driving stop when you get to $10 a gallon? Do Europeans not drive? Do Europeans not have cars? And some of the data may be rather interesting, because auto ownership per 1,000 persons is not the highest in the US by any means. And in fact, it's higher in most of the European countries, and indeed in a few other spots around the world. We rank right next to the UK with around 400 cars per 1,000 population. In fact, I once calculated that if you took into account all the drivers and all the vehicles, trucks, not only cars, households with 2 or 3 vehicles, there were more vehicles around than there are drivers in the US. But nonetheless, I think that saturation points suggest that maybe it doesn't make that much difference as far as the price of gasoline in terms of car ownership. Prices fluctuate. The way that life is today, the auto is a strong vehicle of choice. City structure continues to sprawl. Trucking is the dominant form of intercity freight transportation, and we've had a continued expansion of air travel, despite fluctuations in price. So for some baseline information, the average household today is spending around $9,000 on transportation. That's second only to the expenditures made for housing. And virtually all of these expenditures are made on private vehicles. $3,200 for vehicle purchases, $2,700 for gasoline and motor oil. If we had $10 per gallon gasoline, no matter how that occurs, this would essentially double gasoline and oil expenditures in the short run if nothing else changes. Some of the details of the expenditures are, in my mind, rather interesting because in relationship to all of these expenditures on cars and oil and fuel, all of public transportation for the average household is around $500 a year. Transit, only about $75. And turns out transportation is more of the household budget than is food, more than a number of other things that are very much in the public eye, such as health care, and is second only to housing and is closely tied to housing. So what might happen if we were to go up to $10 a gallon? What would give in the consumer budget? Would we start spending less on food or less on health care or cease to fund our pensions? Would we have more density in our urban areas? Well, probably not immediately because it's rather hard to build new construction for housing in urban areas. Would we reduce our amount of travel, our VMT? Probably the most likely immediate event. Would we start substituting for our car travel a variety of other things, such as communications, transit, which is now only 2% nationwide of our trips, biking, walking, more fuel-efficient vehicles, some car sharing perhaps. Interestingly, carpooling keeps going down with every census. Other intercity modes, probably not air transportation because air transportation has about a 40% cost of fuel in the total production function. So what would we do? New technologies, that's one of the things that WIF has in mind for us to look at. Meanwhile, we have had some interesting recent changes. One of them is great increases in fuel efficiency. I was noting that in the first 3 months of the current production year, the average fuel economy of light trucks has risen to 25 miles per gallon. And the average fuel economy of new cars is now greater than 35 miles per gallon. Go back 10 years, and those would be surprising figures. Interestingly, vehicles are lasting longer, and they come with a variety of additional improvements. Rear cameras are newly required on cars starting, I think, 2 years from now. So I will stuff on the consumer side, and then later talk about freight.
Okay. Paul, I think it's you.
So
You load.
you get to hear most of all of us on this first one. So John, I got thinking about the same things that you have been. Let me pull this up.
Coordination is not our strength, right?
Yeah. Talk about the connected vehicles later. We're just not connected faculty, I guess. So he did bring up, or maybe Wolf brought up, the idea of taxes. So this is part of my usual stump speech. Stu, you've probably heard this 100 million times. But let me ask you this. How much do we pay in fuel taxes? Does anybody know how much per gallon you pay at the pump for your fuel tax?
17, 18 cents?
Okay. Well, you're close in one sense. We have both federal and state tax, right? So if you just look at the federal side of the equation, or the balance sheet, it's 18.4 cents per gallon, right? So you're right in the ballpark on that one. Add another roughly 20 cents per gallon for state. Here in Iowa, we have a little bit more of a different structure depending on if it's ethanol blend or straight gasoline. It varies, but on average, think about 20 cents per gallon. Okay, so what is that total? 38 cents per gallon, roughly? All right, so let me ask you the bigger question. So how much do you pay every year in fuel tax? I'll give you some time to do that mental math. But before I opened with that, how much do we pay in 18 cents and another 20 cents? I would just ask, how much do we pay in fuel taxes every year? And a lot of times the audience would say, $10,000. And I was like, what? So I used to cap it and I say, okay, is it above or below $1,000? So I'll do that today. Is it above or below 1,000? Below. Above or below $500?
Well,
Below. Oh, so we don't really pay very much fuel tax. How much is it? Does anybody work it out? Roughly? So we all roughly drive 15,000 miles per year. Our average vehicle is 25 miles per gallon. Oh, all these facts coming from John. So what does that work out to? It's about $230 per year, right? Which is how much per month? Less than $20 per month. And how much you pay for cable? Right? So if you're thinking about getting to $10 per gallon, it'd be very, very difficult to get the tax portion up that high. How do we make our trips? What do we do for our travel? Right? So I have my title of the slide, type of trips we make by car, truck, and van. So in your daily life, what is the biggest portion of the type of trips that you make? So think about what's the purpose of your trip? And which one dominates?
Go to work.
Work?
Go to the store.
Store, shopping.
Kids.
Okay. Kids. So everybody, we can't get an agreement on which is the number one? All right, well, at least from the National Household Travel Survey, this national survey that's done by the US DOT, our number one trips, I gotta look at this, 21% are personal business and shopping trips. So 20% of your trips go to that. So everybody who said work, you got it. Okay, the next one is another 20%, and that's for social and recreational travel. Okay?
Vacation.
No, not vacation. Actually, you see, that's the last one. It's 1% of our trips are vacation trips. So straight out just vacation. We don't travel that much on vacation. So you could see this comes up. Family errands is another 19%. And now finally we get to work. And currently work trips are about 16% of our trips. Yeah?
These percentiles are based on distance, I assume?
No, just type of trips. Right? It's not controlled based on travel. So we could, since I'm eating up all my time, So here's how the rest of our trip making falls out. So think about this. If that fuel price did get to $10 per gallon, what part of this are you going to be probably reducing? Right? So are you thinking about reducing the shopping trips or the social recreational trips or going to visit family and friends? I would sure like to get rid of medical on my side. I don't know, some dentists over here says something about preventative health care. I don't know.
Very important trips.
Okay, so think about when fuel prices do increase, where can we cut, or what do we cut? All right, so a few more slides here. I apologize for, oh, okay, we can read this. So here's how we break down our costs. So as John said, our total transportation expenditures in a given year, and this is for the most recent data that comes from the consumer survey, consumer expenditure survey. So we're at about $8,000 per householder per consuming unit, which is generally a household. It's $8,000 per year. And then that's broken down, the vehicle purchase is about $3,000 of that total. Other expenses, maintenance and repair, vehicle insurance. What I pulled out of here, the gasoline is about $2,600. So again, think about what would be tied to that fuel increase. So as John said, you triple the existing price right now, you'd be tripling that oil and motor, unless you're, again, adjusting that budget on what types of trips you're going to be making. Okay. Right, boy, Wolf, you're not doing a good job of controlling me on time, I think.
Yeah, I've got an eye on you.
All right, so.
Okay, you're done.
No, this is my cool slide. All right, so in 2004 was a kind of a milestone marker for consumer expenditures here in the United States, because this was the first year where our household savings as a nation became negative. Right? So we started really living off credit, right, in 2004. So let's think about 2004. What has happened since? Right? We hit 2007, we got the big personal credit crunch. All the credit cards started pulling back, right? Recessions hit. We started more of a recovery, 2009 or 2010. So let's see how we've changed our spending. So this is how that spending for transportation across categories has changed compared to 2004. So this is how we changed in 2005 compared to 2004. Okay, so you see on the right-hand side, we're increasing new car purchases over the previous year. We increased expenditures on gas and fuel from the previous year. We increased vehicle rentals and things, and we're decreasing some. So march through time, 2006. How have we changed? How did we change again from 2004? Well, again, we're increasing spending in car purchases. We're increasing spending on fuel. We're increasing, sorry, can't read over here. The top two categories. 2006, again, 2006, or 2007, sorry, we starting to hit the crunch. So what's changing? Well, we're starting to cut back on new car purchases. We're not buying used cars. Maintenance is somewhat increased. All of a sudden we see 2008, a bigger shift. 2009. Something happened here about how we decided to spend money on transportation. Right? So we're into the recession. You already had the credit crunch. We've lived off our credit cards. We're starting to get a whole lot of debts that are due. So we did start changing how we spent money on transportation. 2010, again the same picture. 2011, again, compared to what we were spending in 2004, well, big change. The only thing that's really increasing is what we're spending on fuel, and that's the natural increase of fuel prices. All right, so that's our behavior as a nation. And what this is for metropolitan areas that are 100,000 to 250,000. So it's mimicking our metropolitan area, so somewhat like us. So think, if we still have this going, plus the increase in fuel prices, then we'll ask you, how are you going to change your behavior? Again, just relative to how we spend our money for other goods and services. The upper line, the high light blue, is our expenditures on housing, right? So from 2004 to 2011, it stayed up there in the 30%. And what we see for transportation, we're just kind of bouncing around, drop down, and then we're starting to increase. But that's a big chunk of our overall household budget, isn't it? And we don't have a lot to squeeze. So if you start increasing your fuel costs, and you don't change your trip making, you got to start thinking about, where am I taking that other money out? We already kind of squeezed our entertainment, which is the purple line here. We already pretty much squeezed that entertainment. So our disposable income, or discretionary income, is pretty tight. Okay, so with that, I'm going to be quiet, and I think Dave is going to talk about, really, how does this affect you and us here in Iowa? Actually, Iowa City.
Is this on? No?
Oh, it's on for the TV, the room mic's over there.
Oh. So my view is a little different. You've woken up in the morning, seen the news, read the paper, gas has gone to $10. The king of Saudi Arabia has passed away, and there's been a coup, and they've decided they don't like the Americans. It's gone immediately to $10. It's an instantaneous flash. It's the Big Bang, and we're several milliseconds past that. You're glad you've got a half a tank of gas. You're doing just fine. You go to work, but all day long, that's all you can think about. And so in the process, during the day, various people around town are figuring out what has to change. The $10 gasoline also affects the transit systems. It affects our van pool programs. It affects a whole variety of things. It's not just you. So what I've done here is taken the university population as we know it and put together a little bit about what we know happens here. There's 17,500 people that work full-time for the university. We've broken it down by how far they live from campus, and then taken some calculations and figured out what it would cost per month for each of these different options, and we'll do some comparisons. So I'll start with the first one, 0 to 3 miles. We've assumed the 1.5 mile average single trip length. And $64, current price today, 55 of that is parking. The rest is gasoline. If gasoline goes to $10, you're not going to change one darn thing. One or two, Jim Throgmorton might. Most of you won't change anything because it isn't a high enough threshold to make things differently. As you move out further to the right, where the distance gets greater, it becomes kind of extraordinary. Now the last column that shows people who live over 100 miles from campus, that's a little bit misleading because some of those people live in other cities and work in other cities for the university, so maybe I shouldn't have even included it, but I wanted to make my numbers add up. But you can see, so personal driving gets pretty expensive pretty fast as you live further away from campus. The van pool program, which we've operated since 1978, which Professor Fuller had a lot to do with starting, is an alternative for people who live further away. And you can see maxi vans, minivans, the difference is in a maxi van we have maybe 15 people, 14 pay. In a minivan we have 7 people, 6 pay. And the cost is divided among the payees, the payers, I'm sorry. And we subsidize a certain portion of that, but they pay 100% of the variable cost. So in that van pool charge is fuel, maintenance, and the actual acquisition of the vehicle. So you can see there's quite a bit of discount to take the van pool. The portion that's in the small box, smaller box, I put that there because we don't have any van pools in that region. And it's almost the centerpiece of my discussion. Because the reason we don't have anything in there is because no one finds the cost difference great enough to overcome the inertia to want to drive. They really want to drive. And I can tell you from my experience, they really want to drive. So, but you can see out there those last three categories where it shows 43, 67, and 113. In the maxi van, we have 68 vans right now, 708 people. We used to have about 900 people. The 2008 decline really hurt because there were a lot of layoffs on campus and it broke up a lot of vans and they're hard to reform. But they're pretty healthy in that range. But the key point is if you look at the distance, the 10 to 25 mile distance, you come down, you see the $158 if you drive alone and the 43 for the maxi van. That $100 threshold is kind of approximately where people start to think about making choices. There's not an absolute figure, it depends on all kinds of things. But that's where we start to see a change. Below that, nothing. Above that, people make more changes. Anyway, I put in moped, fuel 75 miles per gallon. If you do the online search and talk to people, moped MPG runs from 40 to 144. Nobody I know gets 144, but you can. And it's mostly a student phenomenon. But if gasoline prices went to $10, more people might use mopeds. But the main point of me showing it there, along with transit and bike and walk, is that there's really only so far, there's only certain distances you're willing to do these things. I know there are people who bike further than that, people who walk further than that, but not every day, not year-round. This is a northern climate. The moped is not a practical alternative for 25 miles out year-round. So the truth of the matter is in that instant of change, you have very few things you can do, or very few things you're willing to do. And all of this is about housing choices. Every single, I learned a long time ago that the reason people drive to campus is because of where they choose to live. And I figured out they choose to live there because they can't afford to live here. They have a spouse that works at Cedar Rapids, and so they split the distance. 858 full-time employees come out of Cedar Rapids. We have 14 van pools out of Cedar Rapids alone. But that's the fourth or fifth largest, so Iowa City is the largest. Coralville, Iowa City is like 7,500, Coralville is 2,200, North Liberty is 1,700 or 1,800. And I think it goes to Cedar Rapids and Salt. So, transit, I talked to Iowa City Transit, talked to Chris O'Brien, he helped me right now. The 15/28, if you were a university employee and came to us and just told us you would give up your parking permit, we would subsidize the bus pass, which is already subsidized by Iowa City Transit, thank you, Chris. We would sell you one for $15, and if you look at the map of Iowa City, there's a lot of transit, but it stops at the edge of town and transit is not available to anybody else. It must be close to town, but it would, if you don't have a parking permit with, or if you're not purchasing it through us, it's 28. Talk to Chris, price of fuel would triple for them. It would add $1.3 million to their budget. They would have two choices in the short run. Cut 13,000 of their 54,000 hours of service, or double their fares. And that reflects a doubling of fare. On a daily basis, you go from $1 to $2. So the 30 and 56 just shows what might happen, what they would have to do to raise their fares. In CAN bus, which also is part of our department, we run 82,000 hours of service. We would have to cut 36,000 hours to compensate the total cost of increase in gas prices. So those are the kinds of choices. I made it an instantaneous kind of comparison. I know over time lots of things open up. I find it impossible to predict all the choices people would make, but this gives you a snapshot. Thank you.
Thank you. So, that gives us some context. Not necessarily a happy context, but a context. Any comments or questions or concerns or yes sir? So yes sir. Please, before you begin, could you tell us who you are so we have a record? And then...
Sure. My name's Jim Throgmorton. I'm a member of the Iowa City City Council and a former colleague of John's and Paul's and a good friend of Dave's. And we don't know each other. So I'm really thrilled that y'all are here. I've been announcing this event at Iowa City Council meetings and tweeting about it and stuff like that. And anyhow, none of you mentioned negative externalities. From an economic point of view and an environmental point of view, I would think that's crucial. So I'd like to hear some commentary about that. And what do I mean by negative externalities? I mean costs that are borne by people who are neither producers nor consumers and have no ability to influence the price. So there are costs not internalized into the price of goods that one buys, like the price of the gallon of gasoline. And particular examples of that would be like the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And another would be carbon and the threat of global climate change, which, you know, and according to the literature I read, is a very serious threat. So I'd like to know about negative externalities and how that would influence your thinking.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, you're exactly right. There are negative externalities. We didn't talk about those. There are also extensive subsidies. We didn't talk about those. Subsidies of all kinds. Actually, we were hearing a little bit about transit subsidies, but the automobile subsidies are great as well. So if you were to take these kinds of subsidies into account, take the externalities into account, I think if you were to price those into the price of a gallon of gasoline, you're already up to $10. I did some work years ago for the Federal Highway Administration trying to ask exactly that question in terms of a price of automobile use. What would be the cost of these subsidies and how do you cost them out? Well, many of you are medical professionals. You know that there are all kinds of health impacts, but there are just innumerable impacts of all kinds on wildlife, impacts on, interestingly, we tried to price out the additional amount of painting necessary in Los Angeles, where Jim once was, as a result of air pollution in the South Coast Air Pollution District. All of these added together are very extensive, but since we don't pay them, they don't really enter into the individual decisions of consumers. That may be wrong, but that's the way the institutions have established matters.
I'm going to play my moderator's role here and throw this back to John and say, all right, you raise some of the external costs, but what about the external benefits? The freedom, if you own a car, to go where you wish. At present, not being tracked by the government as you do it. How do you fold that benefit in terms of personal liberty into the equation?
I guess my answer to that would be that we as consumers have taken those benefits into account when we've made our choice of mode of transportation, when we've made our choice of use of transportation, because we understand those benefits from the individual standpoint, and to the extent they exist, we then pay for them.
Okay, and then another clarifying point. You said that we don't take into account things like the need to repaint things in Los Angeles because we don't pay for those. Who does? The paint fairy, or someone somewhere is paying that bill?
Someone who is paying is not necessarily the person who's causing the damage.
Okay, but
shouldn't there be a nexus between those who generate the externalities and those who must put up with them?
I'm just asking, yeah, fine, you can put that, and you can then say, you know, what other benefits? Is there a balance that we make as a society between what some of us see as unreasonable costs and some of us see as very important benefits?
Seems to me that as a society, and as individuals in that society, we really pay very little attention to the whole question of benefits and costs. We are faced with decisions to make. We make those decisions. Those decisions are influenced by political considerations, influenced by the way that we've established institutions, and so we have an individual decision that is not fully influenced by externalities.
Fair enough. again, thinking in these terms, you mentioned that transit was subsidized, right?
Yes.
And so one of the things I do when I'm teaching my transportation class is I always thank my students for subsidizing my bus pass. And that gets their attention. So should they have to subsidize my bus pass? I mean, after all, I'm being paid by them, if you will, once through their tuition. Should they also have to pay me again through my bus pass?
You're a very fortunate bus user. What I would say is that the usual answer to that, and it's interesting, but it comes partly in the kinds of local bond decision-making that has occurred in city after city around the country, where the taxpayer has been quite willing to subsidize others. It comes about through the belief, whether it's real or not, that if I can only get that professor on the bus, I'll have more space on the highway or the street for my operations.
And given that only 2% of our trips are on transit, is that really working?
One has to look at the geographic distribution of those trips, and certainly it's working in New York City, which has a little bit less than half of all the trips on transit in the country, and essentially is making the system's operating cost out of fares. The question of whether transit ought to be subsidized generally, I think, is something that is picked up on by every city council, is debated and decided in terms of there being some users who can't afford other forms of transportation, some users who aren't able to utilize automobiles or bicycles or walk for that matter, and for whom transit is a reasonable substitute. There is, I would say, in general, a perceived public benefit to having transit subsidies.
Oh, and don't get me wrong, I'd agree with you. So, yes.
My name's Dirk Maurer. We've considered how you and I as individuals get from one place to another and the effect that a drastic increase in gasoline prices would have on that. But everything we get takes fuel to get it to us. Our food is coming from 1,000 miles away. We order stuff on the internet and it's coming from all over the country. The commodities we produce here in Iowa are going very far away. All that takes fuel. Are we going to be talking about some of that as well tonight?
Yes, we have a section coming up on what you might call commercial issues in a few minutes. Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Tom Pursuit. I live in Coralville. I'm wondering if you're using the right metric when you talk about trips. So, personal example, my wife and I each own a car. My car stays mostly in town and I use it for commuting. And I buy roughly 1 tank of gas a month for that vehicle. We travel to see family several times a month, and we usually use her vehicle, which is more fuel efficient for long distance. And we might buy 2 tanks or 3 tanks of gas, actually probably 4 tanks of gas for that vehicle. So to use the number of trips versus the number of miles traveled, isn't the miles traveled a better way to look at it than the number of trips if you're doing comparisons on vehicle use and consequently gasoline expenditure?
Paul, I think that's yours.
Yeah. For brevity, I picked trips and trip purposes because we relate much more to why you took that trip versus how long you've taken the trip. Now, there's also some regularities in work-related trips. They tend to be 10 miles and under, and that's repeatable for decades and decades. We tend to look also for travel time as a metric. Commute times, 25 minutes is the average commute time in the U.S. We're fortunate here in Iowa City, it's under 16 minutes. So there's many metrics that we do try to measure the impact of transportation. I think what you're illustrating is how we've started to think about our household budgets and how we allocate those to trips. Right? Would you have thought 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, that you would have 2 cars and you would cycle back and forth based on fuel efficiency?
Probably not.
Probably not. So I guess to directly answer that question was, yes, if you look at miles traveled, that distribution changes, but not drastically. Because
Yeah, I just want to say, so I run the university's parking system, and our whole program is parking demand reduction. We don't really care how far you drive. What we want is people not to come to campus and park because it actually lowers the cost of providing parking. So it is, in that sense, for us, it is trips, the number of trips. I put that up there to show the impact of $10 a gallon gasoline, which is miles based. But when you look at the amount of land we consume to provide parking for you all to do all those errands, just look at an aerial photograph, not just the university commuter parking, the whole city. It is all a parking lot. I'm serious. There's more parking and street pavement than there is any housing land use. It's phenomenal. So there's 2 ways to count it. It depends on what you're looking for. It's just a short answer. Our goal in parking and transportation is to reduce the demand for parking. Not 100%, because then we wouldn't have any revenue to subsidize the bus passes.
And I want that subsidy. So, very quickly, Paul.
real quick,
Yeah.
just on the VMT, another interesting thing that we've seen from a national perspective since 2004. 2004, 2005, 2006, we were continuing growing VMT in the United States at 3% per year. That was consistent, and that's been consistent for, again, 30 years or so. 2007 was the first year as a nation we drove less than we did in the previous year. So 2007, we saw an actual decrease in VMT. That was followed in 2008 with a leveling off. 2009 and present, we're increasing VMT, but not at the previous rate that we had, so it's less than the 3%, and we are not at the peak travel that we had in 2006. So VMT does matter.
Yeah.
It does matter.
So, John, you were going to take us through some more things, and I think we'll do that.
Okay.
If you could. I think you're...
Let's see if I can.
Yeah.
So, what about business? What about this matter of where we get our stuff and where it goes? What we find is that there is a decided preponderance of freight movement by truck. About 75% of all freight in the U.S. is moved by truck. By value, you can measure it in terms of the numbers of ton miles or numbers of tons transported, but especially for the shorter distances, truck is by far the greatest amount. Truck operating costs are very strongly fuel related. This has been an increasing problem for trucking firms. They've added fuel surcharges to their rates, but nonetheless, 40% approximately of the truck operating costs are for fuel. So if we were to equate diesel, which is a little bit more expensive but gets better miles per gallon, to $10 gasoline, I haven't calculated exactly how much this might mean for various distances of trucking, but obviously it would be a major increase. It would be a major increase not only in trucking, but decidedly so in air freight transportation. So railroads are the answer, right? Well, yes, they would be impacted the same way, however. And much more importantly, as we're seeing with various kinds of agricultural movements being essentially waylaid by oil movements in North Dakota, there's not a lot of capacity for rail freight in this country. What about water transportation? We're lucky to be near the Mississippi. The Mississippi-Ohio system is the chief form of inland waterway transportation, but you have very few inland waterways in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, so forth. So the capacity of substitutes, I think, is one of the limiting factors in the amount of substitution that could take place. Now, interestingly, over the last 50 years or so, transport cost as a part of the GDP, gross domestic product, have been falling year after year after year. We've been getting more efficient in our transportation and in our distribution systems. If we were to have this kind of an increase in the price of fuel, my rough estimate is that transport costs would rise instead of fall, and rise to roughly 16% of GDP. What does this mean? Well, to some extent, yes, you can have modal substitution. There might be some substitution of different factors, production factors, in freight production. One would hope there would be technological improvements. There have been fairly substantial ones in recent years, but more perhaps in engine technology. We would have slower distribution channels. It would certainly be less efficient for a truck to be traveling 70 miles per hour than 55 miles per hour. We would have higher consumer prices because all of the goods that we produce essentially have some element of truck transportation. We might very well have production taking place closer to consumption and perhaps of a different and reduced scale. We would definitely have far less international trade. And not only in terms of international trade, but I think there'd be a large reduction in international travel as well, and a reduction in tourism. There'd be some reduction in freight sector employment. So I think that the business impacts, as the gentleman in the back was suggesting, are really rather profound and impact all of our households, all of our consumer prices. There are a variety of complicating factors in the elasticity of both demand and supply for transportation, and I just mentioned a few of them down here. I think that we'll be getting into technology as a possible improvement in the supply side of transportation. But all of these are great uncertainties, and exactly how they play out as a decade or two go ahead is really pretty difficult to say. Those were the old times. Are these the new times? And certainly we have, I see some bicycle advocates in the audience, and quite possibly we would get a bit of a stimulus, at least for certain types of travel in bicycle transportation. With?
Thank you, John. John, a quick question for you related to this that has come to me, and I don't mean to be picking on you with my questions, but I am, so I will. I've heard it suggested that organizations like Amazon, because they have the potential to stop a whole bunch of us going out shopping, could actually be greener, if you will. Or in the context we're talking about, $10 a gallon gas, cheaper, more economical, than us going out and doing that shopping on our own. Any thoughts, any comments, insights?
Well, I guess one insight would be that not all consumer shopping is simply to buy. There's a social element in it, and I suspect some of that would continue. Yes, it's possible that you could get area distribution systems where not just Amazon, but others deliver to your home. On the other hand, one of the things that you find is that the additional price of fuel is going to raise that kind of cost rather substantially. Interestingly enough, getting back to my bicycle slide, you can have bicycle distribution systems, and who knows, you might be able to get from your local grocery store by means of a delivery bicycle in a much cheaper form than by using a truck distribution system.
So lots of room for innovation there.
Yes.
So to bring it back to Amazon, one of the things that we have seen since the past holiday season is Amazon Prime, the membership that you sign up for to guarantee your second day air or second day delivery. Went from $75 to $90. And they catch that all on the increased cost of transportation. Not just fuel, but actually the cost of increasing the distribution hubs that they have, the distribution centers themselves. So that's effect of more business. Now to directly answer your question, if you look at the national trends, we have not cut back on the amount of shopping trips. So we may be getting more and more goods from Amazon and other deliveries by FedEx and UPS. but that's not reducing the types of trips. We're still going out and shopping.
I must confess to a certain puzzlement at this nature of shopping being a social interaction, but that's just me. Any comments on this from the audience? Does that, so you'd asked about this, have we covered that issue or teased on it, or?
I think it begins to incorporate the problem that drastically increased fuel prices would have. It affects everything.
Yes, yes, it certainly does. Other thoughts? Insights? Yes? Please.
Hi. Have you thought about...
Oh, your name? If you...
Sarah Reardon. I'm a University of Iowa student.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
So a lot of your ideas have been sort of how business would go on as usual with small changes. But has anyone thought about, like, if due to political troubles, say, gas went very suddenly up to $10 right away, would that create a sort of cascading systems failure? Suddenly a lot of businesses, it wasn't cost effective for them to bother shipping goods anymore. It wasn't worth their bother to stock grocery stores. And it wasn't worth a lot of people's bother to make the long drive to work because they wouldn't even earn enough to cover the gas. Could that, create some sort of super recession and with major problems?
Total system collapse,
Yes.
cats and dogs living together, that sort of thing. What do you think, folks?
Yes.
Okay, good answer.
Yeah, I think we're all trying to get people to think about all these unintended consequences of, and the butterfly effect, things that you don't think of as directly being related to gasoline.
Yeah. This is an example in my slide when I showed the cost of gas rising for those people who live a long ways away. Those numbers became extraordinary. We do even now encounter people who just decide it's not worth coming to the university to work anymore and find some smaller, meaning lower paying job in their own community because the trade-off isn't worth it. So it already happens on a small scale. You can imagine everything sort of grinding to a halt in a serious crisis if it all happened at once.
Yeah. So you had a question or comment?
Me?
Yes, you.
Yeah, Jim Conver. There are some things that we're overlooking, I think, and that is the need to travel is getting more and more serious. For example, if I want to buy a little package of nails to hang a picture on the wall, I have to travel 5 or 6 miles now to go way out to Menards to get this item. And that is because stores have put all the onus on consumers to do the traveling to them. They're not losing any money if we can get to them. So we're spending all this money to do all sorts of incidental shopping, not just for food, but for other daily items. And there are no more mom and pop stores around anymore to take care of that need like there are in other countries. And so we're forced, literally, to use cars and do all this driving for things that we need on a daily basis, or at least a monthly basis, that we can't avoid. Even if you have a condominium or an apartment downtown, you still want to hang a picture. How are you going to get it?
Thoughts?
Well, I would distinguish between short-term adjustments and long-term ones. In other words, the reason we have Menards and the reason we have Costco and so on and so forth, big box stores, is that it is an efficient way to operate. Were we to have greater distribution cost, greater cost of access, then there would be a change in the distribution mechanisms. We'd go back to mom and pop stores. Not completely, not immediately, but there would be indeed that tendency. And the isolated Menards, which really is pretty isolated in Iowa City, would essentially go out of business. We would have a downtown store instead for that picture hanging nail, and as we once did.
Yes.
Herman Milster. Some of us remember perhaps back to the 70s when there was a strong federal push to increase the average amount of mile per gallon you get. And one of the ways they did that was lowering the speed limits on Interstate to 55 miles an hour. What would happen on Interstate 80, especially in the eastern half of Iowa, if the speed limit was 55? Would it gridlock?
Well, I know what would happen in Nebraska on I-80. A whole bunch of people would go start raving nuts. But,
There would be a lot fewer people killed.
Well, recognize also that at 55, you have more throughput or highway than you do at 70 or 75. So gridlock is not what would occur. And greatly increased time cost for people to go longer distance is what would take place.
It's interesting in other areas of the world, and I hesitate to raise this bugbear issue, but where speed cameras, for example, are accepted part of traffic management. For example, on the M25 around London in the UK, they control congestion by varying the speed limit, and the variable speed limit is enforced by speed cameras. And people know that if they go above the speed limit, they will get a ticket. And as a result of putting those in, they have managed the congestion quite effectively on that area. It's still congested and you don't travel at 70 miles an hour all the time, but it's a lot more efficient to travel somewhere at 30 miles an hour than to go nowhere at 0 miles an hour, which was the alternative. So, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, back to the practical questions, right? Teresa Marshall, raised by others. The cost of food, what would be the actual increase in cost of food? Partly I'm thinking we have a huge number of food insecure individuals in the country, Iowa included. Would this make, obviously to make that problem worse, but to what extent would we see more severe malnutrition as well as undernutrition, and that then would have impact on healthcare costs, and what's our
Well,
you have those slides.
Yeah, I don't have those slides, but going from some of the values that John has pulled up, 40% of your trucking costs are fuel costs themselves. And so if you're assuming, and most of our food is trucked, especially we're about 80% within 100 miles. So you could quickly say if you're doubling the cost, you're going to be taking that, so 40% of $10 and add another $4 to that bill. Directly just for the fuel. I thought you were going to bring up, which nobody's brought up yet, we're talking about fuel implicitly, or about vehicles. If fuel prices also increase, petrochemicals generally will increase, which then affects the production of food, which I think would be a bigger cost than the trucking. John will correct me if I'm wrong.
Fertilizers, tractors, so on and so forth. But I think it also depends on the particular food crop, because there are quite different portions of transportation costs in different foods. So you'd have an adjustment. The other aspect is when people adjust their food buying habits. We'd use more of our backyard vegetables, but not everyone has a backyard where they're growing vegetables, at least not yet. But we'd also, I think, have a lot less in the way of eating out, which has both a travel component and also an increased price component. So it's hard to say what people would do. It would differ from family to family. I think that your point about some folks being at the margin already is a very real one. Think of people using the food pantries. Think of people using the crisis center. Are they going to be able to with an increase in fuel prices? They're already at the margin. What do you do in those cases?
And how would it impact using corn to make ethanol? Maybe that's a whole nother issue. Anyway. Jim, last question, and then we'll move on to the third segment.
I want to make a couple of points. One is, if the past is prolonged, what I would expect to see happen is that if we were in the scenario that Dave pointed to, what I'd expect to see happen is that people would be furious and be pointing fingers of blame at everybody you could imagine. It's the Saudis' fault, it's the president's fault, it's Congress's fault, and that would be the topic of conversation. People would be angry and pointing fingers. The other thing I'd like to bring up is I'd like to challenge what you said about freedom and mobility. Now, I totally understand how people feel about cars and feel they're given freedom and mobility. I've lived in like over 3 years of my life in Europe. And for many months I lived in Berlin, Germany. I was able to get around that city very, very easily by S-Bahn, by U-Bahn, by bus, and on foot. I felt free. Unlike here, where I feel tied to a car, even though I walk. I go a mile and a half up there, I walk here and walk back every day. My wife and I have chosen to live our lives that way. So anyhow, there are choices available that ought to be thought of.
I would agree with you completely. I think that is entirely a freedom of choice. If you will, one man's freedom is another man's ball and chain. And that's one of the issues that we have to struggle with in all of this. Sue, technology. We thought we shouldn't be totally negative in all of this.
And I don't have any graphs.
No, she's got better
I
stuff.
have pictures.
She's got videos.
One thing that Paul and I talked about while we were working on this seminar was that we really haven't touched on was things like police cars and school buses and garbage trucks and all of those services that rely on transportation that are probably going to raise your taxes. Right, Mr. City Council?
Just wait.
Yeah. So I am at National Advanced Driving Center where parking is free. I'm not saying that to you.
But it still takes
Yeah, it still
Yeah.
takes space.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about driving habits. I mean, we study people and vehicles at our center, and so I think Paul may talk a little bit about car sharing, but I think our vehicles are going to change a little bit. We're going to see, these are just flashing some displays that are already in vehicles that are showing your moment-to-moment eco-driving. There's systems being discussed that make this a competitive thing. And there's hypermilers, if anyone's heard of that, people who post on the internet, especially people who have hybrids, about, I got 80 miles to the gallon this morning. So this display is actually from a study we've done looking at eco-driving displays. Does anyone here have a hybrid? A lot of people report when they first get their hybrid, they're fairly obsessed with the little battery thing that tells you your miles per gallon. It's sort of a distraction issue. I think the other thing is that just the way you drive, you aren't going to floor it when you take off. You aren't going to keep your foot on the gas until you come up to the stop sign. You're going to start coasting more, and that little indicator in your car is going to become your best friend. And I think people will sort of start changing their moment-to-moment driving habits. I think we're going to have lighter vehicles. In the long run, this is probably not a 2 to 5 years. I'm probably more on a 10 to 20 year thing. This may be the longer term repercussions. There's safety concerns, I think, even as we were talking. If we get to the point where we all sort of get rid of our cars and we have bikes and trucks, that's not a good mix for safety. We like vehicles to kind of be the same size. Now, if we all end up with stackable vehicles, like the photo in the lower right corner, or some of the personal transport vehicles that are being proposed and are actually on the road, that one on the bottom is a Segway, basically. With a little hood on it. That if every car was lighter, then they'll be consuming less fuel too. So you're going to get much better fuel economy with a lighter vehicle. And so the safety concerns, though, become, again, back to that vehicle mix. I think we're going to see more hybrids, more alternative vehicle, fuel sources in the long run, and we're already seeing that now in terms of, electric vehicles, both fuel cell and plug-in. And then that leads us to automated vehicles, and here's the Google car in the lower left with no driver in it, and they're coming. I think we're going to see a slow introduction of automation through partial automation in these vehicle systems, so systems that do automatic braking. They may govern your speed for you so that it this intelligent fuel use system in your car will take over and do the acceleration and deceleration and have some knowledge of upcoming traffic. There are already systems, particularly in heavy trucks, that tell you when to shift, because the map knows that there's a hill coming up, and it says, oh, you know what, you should downshift now, and there's real savings to these trucking fleets that use these systems. The federal government has a large program, sort of illustrated by the cars with the little rings around them, of connected vehicles, and this is a system where every vehicle will have a radio on it that is emitting a signal that says, I'm here. Here I am, here I am. And the other vehicles will know that they're coming. You'll be able to know that there's a stalled vehicle over the hill, even though you can't see it because it's sending a radio signal. And just recently, the US DOT has sort of indicated that they intend to pursue this for real. It's been sort of an R&D project for many years. There's a large pilot test going on in Ann Arbor with thousands of vehicles equipped with these radios. So they may be required in vehicles in a few years. So what does that mean? This is some videos my colleague Chris Schwartz here developed. So if we were all connected and possibly all automated, we may never have to stop at an intersection because the system's going to know that when we're coming, and so you could make a reservation for the intersection. Here I come, hello, here I come, Mr. Traffic Signal. Now I'm going to be there in 2.7 seconds, and so that might look something like this from the air. So look, nobody ever has to stop. So that's where your fuel loss is starting and stopping. That looked great. So efficient. We all want that, right? So this is what it would look like from the driver's point of view in your semi-automated vehicle. Here we go. We're going through the intersection. Seamless. Who's ready to sign up? So we're looking at these issues, and DOT is interested in this more for a safety benefit. I mean, clearly there are congestion benefits, but I think as fuel costs rise, or if we have the coup, I think this type of technology is only going to accelerate because there's also real fuel costs as well. So just in case you think this is new, it's not. They built an electronic highway in Nebraska in 1957.
What happened to it? It
I
failed.
know, it was like a half a mile. So.
I must say that little video of the intersection from the driver's viewpoint gives new potential meaning to that whole blue screen of death thing. Just to put this in context, you can already buy, and these are not high-end vehicles, but new cars that have automated adaptive cruise control that will adjust their speed to the speed of the vehicle in front of you. You all know you can get something that will park itself, which is fine, but it doesn't cover getting you yet to the point where you can park. There's lane warnings if you stray out of a lane. Volvo over in Sweden are working with the authorities there that new Volvo cars that are out on the market will basically be talking to the state maintenance trucks during the wintertime, sharing condition information about the condition of the road surface. Don't think that automated cars are 20 years away. They're not. Even without the $10 a gallon gas. Within 10 years, it'll be an option to buy. Within 20 years, I think most new cars, if not all, will have it in one form or another. So say goodbye to the driving test. Paul, do you want to...
I get to go again?
Yeah, you do.
So, but I have a question
This is beautiful.
to Sue. What's holding up, what would hold up the progression to an automated vehicle and an automated
There are a lot of legal issues of whose fault is it if it crashes? Is it you or is it the manufacturer?
It's the lawyer.
It's the one. There are a lot of societal issues of, you know, we all screamed when we looked at that. So especially for pedestrians and bicyclists who really rely on eye contact. We have any motorcyclists in the room. You really want to see that that driver sees you. And if there's not a driver, are you going to feel right stepping out in front of that car? So there's a lot of system trust issues. And it, you know, the first crash that will happen, and we met with Google Car here last week, and you know, they know there will be a crash. I mean, someone will hit them if you know, their system may be fine, but they're still going to be hit. So there's just a lot of societal issues. It's not the technology that's the problem.
That intersection didn't show any pedestrians.
Right, right. So some of these systems you'll have on your smartphone, you have an app that is also sending the signal. So that's like a huge safety benefit for vulnerable road users if they can enter the system and sort of increase their visibility through an electronic signal. And maybe we won't have to wear the fluorescent yellow vests when we bike.
Yeah. Well, I guess I get to a few more minutes to start thinking about how can we start adjusting our expenditures on transportation. We saw our household budget and how we spend within transportation on new vehicles, on fuel and things like that. But can we actually start relying on technology to help us reduce some of that expenditures? You know, Sue did the great technology on the fuel efficiency, lighter cars, better programmed cars, cars that know when hills are coming. But how about if we start thinking about the other parts of that budget? Let's say, do you really need to go out and buy a new car or a used car? Or can you start looking at car sharing? Now, so let me say that today, or ask you this. How many people have ever used or are members of Zipcar? You know those two cars over there, right outside our window? So we got a few people here. I have to confess, I do. I also have to confess, I gave up my car here in Iowa City January 2nd, 2007. So yes, it's a challenge sometimes to get around, but with our bus system, with walking, I don't bike, and the rental fleets that we have, whether it's Zipcar, the hourly rates, or the Hertz and Enterprise, someone can actually get around without having their own personal vehicle. So let me walk through how can we do the car sharing? Can that be part of our budget? So looking at the vehicle rental systems, I just pulled the top 4 rental companies that we have here in the United States. So Enterprise is the largest. It has nearly 1 million vehicles in their fleet, and they pull in about $11 billion per year on rentals. Okay, and they're capturing the market of the hourly rental. So no longer is it you have to buy or rent per day or per week. So it's looking at what technology is enabling us to move to that so you don't have to own your own vehicle. You could share it. You could share ownership just as you share ownership if you're a member of Zipcar. So here's the technology behind it. And it's just all here today. So we have e-commerce enabled by the internet. You have smartphones. Right? Your reservations are all done over the smartphone or calling in if you want, or on the internet. The vehicle itself is equipped with existing technology of GPS. It knows where that vehicle is. Now here goes something that's really relevant for some of the research that I've done. When we looked at a government system requesting or requiring GPS in vehicles, we had a big public kickback on that. But this is a consumer choice. I'm okay with Zipcar knowing where I am. Right? But that's a consumer choice. Government didn't tell me I had to. So you have GPS, and then you have the RFID cards. So this is my key to get into Zipcars. Right? So again, it's a technology. When did this all come? Well, let's just quickly pull together the timeline. So e-commerce started roughly in 1994. It's when the internet first had the secure transactions. Right? It allowed for e-commerce to start. And Amazon and eBay, we talked about already. They started mid-90s. Okay? So that started the framework. Smartphones, first time smartphones was mentioned was 1997. Mass adoption, 2006. So again, what I'm trying to get here is technology is we could keep adding more technologies to enhance our travel behavior. Again, if you're looking at it as cost reduction, perhaps we have that. The low-cost RFID tag started in 1990 on mass distribution. It was tagging inventory for Procter & Gamble. They wanted to know where their products were anywhere in the supply chain. Again, now it's in my back pocket. Again, unlocks the vehicle for me. Wi-Fi, commercially at least, was available in 2000. Okay? So again, the vehicles are communicating throughout a very large region from one another. And then the GPS system, 2000 was the benchmark year where they stopped scrambling the signal and allowed any commercial and private use of the GPS signal. So again, why do I bring this up? These are technologies that were just about 10 years old before they were introduced into alternative transportation. So here's the car sharing, and look how that has grown as that technology also has matured. So in the United States, on the left-hand side, car sharing members. We're definitely in the early adoption phase of this. Right? So if you look at technology, it has this nice S-curve. Right? So we're in the very beginning of people accepted it, and we're starting to increase that. So if we follow that whole idea of technology adoption, we've got a long way of a whole lot more people willing to join this. And then the car sharing fleet. Again, we see this is increasing. 2013 was the year where Enterprise actually bought Zipcar. So now we have Enterprise following this model. Hertz has a similar time demand. It's 24 hours, 7, they label it. Again, all looking for, can you provide these options for transportation that are lower cost? And by the way, for the Zipcar, I'm not trying to promote Zipcar, it's just the system I use. This weekend I rented it for 3 hours. I needed to do some errands. Actually, I needed to go to Menards. $9 per hour, right? And you go, oh wow, that's a lot. But think about it, that's $9 per hour. That includes your insurance. It includes fuel. You don't pay out of your pocket for the fuel. And the rental. So $9 per hour. Think about how much you pay per hour owning your own vehicle. Right? You're not using it every day. But if, let's say, it's 12 hours, you're paying for use of it for 16 hours every day, that turns out to be about $1.50 per hour for you to own and operate a vehicle that's sitting in your car or your driveway or your parking lot. Right? If you actually back calculate and say, how much are you paying per hour for the hours you actually use, you're up around $20 to $25 per hour of actual use. Right? So instead of thinking about it per mile, think about it per time. Right? So these turn out to be actually fairly good alternative to transportation. Again, so with that, I'll step down, and I bet Wilf is going to have some questions for John.
No. Actually, I had a question for you. Are you signing people up for Zipcar immediately after this?
Actually, I think if you do, I get like $50 in free travel.
I just want to take that model and think about automated vehicles. Automated vehicles are going to change the model of vehicle ownership because it's very easy to share if it's automated. I just say, come get me, and a car shows up. And I can share it with somebody else, or one household has it. But I think it's going to really change when we really truly get to driverless vehicles. There's just going to be automatic taxis running all over the place, and probably nobody will own a car.
Where's the fun in that? Any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns? Any of you looking forward to going through that intersection? Yes.
Charlie, there's precious little talk about public transportation here. I mean, we heard that you don't want to take public transportation because you don't want the government to know who you are, but very little talk about it. It was sort of dismissed because it was said that the cost of gasoline would increase the cost of rail transportation. Well, it's true, but it costs a lot less per ton to move goods by rail than it does by truck. And we also know that General Motors and the other Detroit folks, back when I was a kid, I grew up in Dallas, we had streetcars in Dallas. General Motors bought the streetcar system in Dallas and many other places because they were moving people into cars. We had a model. We had a way of moving around. We still have that model in Europe and many places in Europe, and certainly in Japan, where you can get on a train anywhere and go anywhere else. And here, we can't get a train anywhere close to Iowa City, even though we've tried and tried and tried, even though we had a governor who was sort of for it. And I didn't mean to preach, but I'm saying, even the models that you folks are presenting all show individual cars with individual people in them, all going to their individual places, and that's the model we have in our heads. And I can't help but think how the people in the 20s and the 30s looked at the future and what they saw. They saw their present projected into the future. And this seems to me, we're doing it here too. Public transportation works really well. I lived in DC for a while. You know, you can go pretty much anywhere in the DC area taking public transportation or walking. You can get there. Now I know that doesn't work very well in Iowa, but because there's a lot greater distance between places and a lot fewer people. But public transportation is still an answer. There was an interurban that went from Iowa City to Cedar Rapids at one point. You know.
It does work in certain places, yeah. And I think I for one love riding the bus here, and as I say, I thank my students for their subsidy. There are technologies coming out with shifting trucks around. There's a company selling a platooning solution for trucks, where the lead truck would have a camera showing what they were seeing that would be linked to all the other trucks. The trucks would travel very close to each other to reduce air resistance, and the result would be that you would in essence have a train on the road. John made the point in terms of train, moving freight by train, that we're at capacity, or at least we're rather close to it. There are a few shifts going on. There is less coal now being moved on the railways because we've had a dramatic move away from using coal in electrical generation in this country over the last 5 years to using natural gas. A lot of that, though, the slack has been picked up by oil that is coming out of the ground in North Dakota. Our existing infrastructure on trains is great, and it does a good job. The problem is putting new infrastructure down is very, very costly. To the extent that the only way really, and I would love a high-speed network of railway lines in this country, but it's going to cost an awful lot of money, and that money is not going to come from private industry because they won't make it back. So we need to have a national discussion about how much we are willing to pay in taxes to create a high-speed rail network in this country. And when I say high speed, I mean real high speed, none of this 70 miles an hour crap. 200 miles an hour is where it's at. But that's my own feeling. I don't know what you guys think. 200 miles an hour is really nice. That's, Yes, sir.
May I add a footnote to what you were saying, and also the gentleman over here. I've been an enthusiast for rail transportation for many, many years, because I also had the good fortune of living in Europe and seeing how things work well when you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as we did in the 1970s. And I happened to here on public radio about 3 or 4 weeks ago that the public isn't waiting for the national conversation to start. It's already making up its own mind. And I think last year, 2013, had the highest usage of all forms of public transit, bus, tram, commuter rail, and intercity transportation than at any time since 1955. So the public is changing its mind about how it wants to live and how it wants to spend its time in transit.
John?
Just a quick response to the Afton announcement that you're referring to. Yes, there was a slight increase, not commensurate with the population increase in the same period of time. The proportion of usage has continued going down. Whether that's desirable or not is a whole other matter, but it is a fact. I have a few comments on technology. Because technology is always very uncertain, there are all kinds of potential changes in technology. Some of them are taking place, and actually on the freight side that I hadn't mentioned earlier, with a large substitution of local delivery vehicles using natural gas, electric power as well. And some substitution at the intercity level. For example, train transportation is, the UP has been experimenting with different propulsion systems. The very fact that we've been getting much better engine efficiency in the last few years, and that we have a standard that is going to require great increases in engine efficiency over the next 20-year period, suggests that $10 per gallon gas is not going to really make a difference in the equilibrium. Where it is going to make a difference, though, comes in a few isolated forms of transportation. For example, in air transportation, which travels obviously at high speeds, has a great deal of friction involved, billions are being spent to save 2 or 3 or 4% in the way of energy. The opportunities to do so beyond what is currently within the technological horizon, and especially when one takes into account the carbon footprint of air transportation, suggests to me that there are some forms of transportation where technology is not going to be able to save us. In terms of highway transportation, the chances are much, much better.
Thank you, John. Well, thank you all very much for being with us this evening. I think we've come to the end of our time. I am happy to let you know that if you've enjoyed tonight, you have 3 more opportunities for enjoyment on the coming Tuesday nights going forward. Next week, April the 15th, what if we moved to a sustainable economy/society? I was hoping that was going to be what if we had a hell of a lot simpler tax system, but maybe that's, oh no. April 22nd, what if is what if everyone had health insurance? And then April the 29th, and this is one that would send a chill through not all, but most politicians' hearts. What if everyone voted? So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists, and thanks for all of you.